Welcome to a Tattered Cover virtual event. To learn more about our upcoming events, please visit tatteredcover.com/event. Tonight's guest is Tony Messenger, who is releasing Profit and Punishment. Tony Messenger is the Metro columnist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. In 2019, Messenger won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary for a series of columns on debtors' prisons in Missouri. In 2016, Messenger was awarded a Missouri Honor Medal, the highest award bestowed by the University of Missouri's School of Journalism. That same year, he won a national headliner for editorial writing. In 2015, Messenger was a Pulitzer finalist for his series of editorials on Ferguson and won the Sigma Delta Chi Award for Best Editorials of the Year, given by the Society of Professional Journalists. Messenger lives in Wildwood, Missouri, with his wife and 2 children. He has 4 grown children and 8 grandchildren. Profit and Punishment is his first book. In conversation with him is Alex Burness. Alex Burness covers state government for the Denver Post, with particular focus on criminal justice, fiscal policy, and labor issues. He previously worked for the Boulder Daily Camera, Colorado Independent, and Loveland Reporter Herald. Please welcome Tony and Alex.
Thank you so much to the Tattered Cover for putting this on. And thank you, Tony, for writing this awesome book that we get to talk about. You have really succeeded at making what could be a very dense book, very human. And I know how challenging that can be. I'm struck by how the human stories you detail, though, the politics and the systems that you pretty irrefutably eviscerate in this book tie back in so many cases to such everyday things. That people's lives are upended by teeny tiny snowflakes that turn into snowballs, that a crack in a windshield, a weed pipe that isn't being used, even petty theft of $25 of nail polish or $8.74 of mascara. You write that, and it's true, if you have money, you can make your problems go away. You yourself described being pulled over in Colorado because you'd forgotten to pay an $80 speeding ticket, which is clearly way in your past. But the story you tell is about people who are dogged by these minor things. I think for any of the listeners tonight, if you're of any means, it can be hard to imagine how your whole life could change because of something maybe you do every day. You drive with a cracked windshield, steal some chapstick from Walgreens, or, you don't come to a full stop at a stop sign. But talk about how these snowballs form. How is it that, for example, that $8.74 in mascara for the woman you wrote about turns into $15,000 a year in jail? How do fines and fees snowball like that?
So let's talk about Brooke Bergen. She's one of the main characters of the book. She's the woman that you mentioned who stole an $8 tube of mascara from Walmart in Dent County. It's a county in the middle of Missouri, rural area. She ended up doing a year in county jail for that shoplifting. And then after she got out of jail, she got a bill for her time in jail. And that bill was $15,000. And she was never going to be able to afford that. She was a poor person. She had obviously lost any job that she had while she was in jail. And what the judge required her to do in order to pay down that debt was come back to the courthouse once a month for months on end, so that she could either say, hey, here's another $50, here's $60, here's $100, or, explain to the judge on the weeks when she didn't have any money, hey, I don't have any money to pay down that debt, and face the threat of jail time. And this is the reality of the criminal justice system that poor people know well all over the country, that a lot of people who, as I talk about in my situation, when I lived in Colorado, I grew up in Colorado, shopped at the original Tattered Cover many years ago. I got a speeding ticket in Morrison. Anybody who's driven through Morrison, I know it used to be a speed trap. Don't know if it still is. And I forgot about it. And I ended up getting pulled over one time because I had expired tags, because I forgot to pay for my tags to get renewed, and got handcuffed and got taken to the police station. But I had cash in my wallet to be able to give it to the police station to say, hey, I don't need to be held in jail for this. Let me go. And I didn't lose my kids. and I didn't lose my car, and I didn't end up with my name in the paper, and I didn't have any of these devastating consequences. People like Brooke Bergen, for really minor things like stealing an $8 tube of mascara, often end up in jail. But more often than not, after they do their time in jail, they then get this bill. And often it's a bill for jail time. And sometimes it's also on top of that, bills for all sorts of fines and fees that legislatures have implemented to use the court system to pay for things that have nothing to do with the dispensation of justice. And what it's done is it's created what I talk about in the book, the criminalization of poverty. And for poor people who get caught up in this system, it creates a cycle of debt that is impossible for them to escape.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, in their efforts to escape, I mean, it's so clear that for the folks you write about, and there's hundreds of thousands of them in every single state, if not more, this just does not appear to be a fair fight. What happens is people who might actually have a good case, if not of outright innocence, to at least have some or all of their fees waived or some charges tossed. You know, people by and large don't know that. They don't know how, they don't know to fight back or don't know how to fight back. They don't have attorneys, or they don't have adequate representation. If they do have attorneys, you describe a system where you said at one point a typical public defender in New Orleans would have 19,000 cases a year, or like 7 minutes per client. I'll read a quote from one of the folks in your book, a woman from South Carolina, who says, I didn't know I had the option of having an attorney. I had no idea that we were going to trial right there. I agreed because she's the judge, and I didn't want to get into trouble. There's a lot that props up this system, but can you talk about the knowledge and resource gap, how that's so crucial to what you write about as basically a taxation on poverty?
So this happens to a lot of people. And two of the characters in my book, Kendi Kilman from Norman, Oklahoma, and Sasha Darby from Columbia, South Carolina, had a very similar situation. They're going to court for the first time in their lives, both for really minor misdemeanor charges. And they've never been to court before. And they go to court, and the first thing they find is the bailiff or somebody at the front of the courtroom. It's a packed courtroom. It's one of these law days that judges hold where everybody who faces minor charges over the last month has to show up, and the courtroom's packed. And there's a sheet of paper that says, do you have an attorney? Well, she's poor. No, she doesn't have an attorney. She doesn't even know exactly why she's there, other than she's got this ticket that says you have to come to the court this day. Do you need a public defender? Well, yes. Both Kendi and Sasha thought, I need a public defender. And then it says, do you have $40 to pay for a public defender? Well, neither of them had $40 to pay for a public defender. And so they checked the box to waive their most important right at that particular time, and that is the right to an attorney. And all sorts of poor people who don't know anything about the criminal justice system and don't have anybody walking them through it, that's the first mistake they make. They say, I can't afford this, and so I'm not going to have an attorney. And then they end up doing something in front of the judge or saying something in front of the judge that ends up having massive repercussions on their lives. What they don't realize is that in almost every state, the judge can waive those fees and say, hey, you need an attorney, sign up for the public defender, and they'll make sure that you qualify based on your income, and you get an attorney. Also, most public defender systems will waive those fees. They're in there as a matter of statute. And so even though you can't afford the $40 for a public defender, you still have access to one if you don't waive that right. But on top of that, the other problem that then arises for people in a similar situation is that almost every state also underfunds its public defender system. There's a patchwork of laws that create the public defender system. In some states, you show up and the judge assigns a local attorney on a contract basis to be your public defender. Many states like Missouri have a statewide system. Some states have different systems within whether you're in a city or whether you're in a rural area. But the one thing that is common amongst the public defender system is that they're underfunded. And so when you walk back to the beginning of a person's case, We don't want to forget talking about cash bail. A poor person gets assigned bail by a judge, can't afford to pay it. They actually end up in jail on a shoplifting or an assault or on a minor drug charge, whereas many of the rest of us who can afford to write a check would never spend a night in jail on that situation. So now you're in jail, then you're waiting for the public defender who's got 400 cases that month and can't come see you for a week or two. So now you're in jail for a week or two before you can even meet your public defender. And that public defender can hopefully then file a motion to get your bond reduced so you can get out of jail. So the process begins, that cycle of poverty begins at the very beginning, and it continues throughout. And unfortunately, throughout that process, people who are unfamiliar with the criminal justice system are just flying blind, and they waive their rights to an attorney, or they accept a guilty plea that they probably shouldn't accept without realizing that guilty plea comes with $1,000 of fines and fees that you're going to have to pay. And if you don't pay, the judge is going to threaten you with more jail time. These are all serious and regular consequences of minor charges within the criminal justice system. And most of them happen simply because the courts are allowing themselves to be used by legislatures as fundraising tools, as a way to raise backdoor taxes to pay for other government services.
Mm-hmm. I want to add, by the way, I probably should have said this at the beginning, for anybody participating, if you do have questions, we'll have a little Q&A at the end of this. So drop those in the chat and I can read off a few. The decision to take a guilty plea or whatever it is that leads you to a $1,000 or $5,000 or $10,000 debt with the court. These numbers that arise from little tiny offenses and momentary snap decisions in courts by people who don't really know what they're doing, the consequences can be insurmountable. I mean, truly. I think one good example is, and one you write about, is Philando Castile, who participants here will remember was shot and killed by police during a traffic stop in Minneapolis. One thing I didn't know about his story is that he'd racked up more than $6,000 in fines and fees that he never conquered before he died. And it strikes me that the point of these fees, and you were getting to this a second ago, isn't to correct behavior necessarily, so much as to function as an ATM for governments. I think about Morrison, other towns in Colorado like Mountain View and Lakeside. Front Range residents will know these as infamous speed traps. But if all those speeding tickets were about dangerous driving and trying to cut down on dangerous driving, the money would consistently be reinvested in safer streets or bike lanes, stuff like that, right? But it's not. Where does the money go and why?
It goes to all sorts of areas of government. So what happens is, and it's a problem that is more acute in states similar to Colorado, similar to Missouri, similar to Oklahoma, that have versions of anti-tax legislation built into their constitution. So in Colorado, there's Tabor. Oklahoma has a similar law. Missouri has what's called the Hancock Amendment. And you combine that with the primarily Republican aversion to taxes. And what happens is, when some constituency comes to the state legislature and says, hey, I need money for something. And I'll use an example from the book. The rural sheriffs in Missouri didn't think they were being paid enough. And they went to the legislature and said, hey, we need more money for our retirement. And hey, lawmakers aren't going to say no to the county sheriff. The county sheriff is one of the most powerful political people within a particular region, particularly in a rural area. And so the legislature wants to help the sheriffs, but they're not going to raise taxes to put money into that pension system. So they're going to try to find another way to come up with money. So what they did in Missouri is they passed a $3 fee that goes on every single criminal case in the state of Missouri. So if you get a speeding ticket, if you have a drug case, if you have a major criminal case, you end up having that $3 fee that goes to pay for rural sheriff's retirement. It has nothing to do with the dispensation of justice. You may be in an urban area that doesn't have a sheriff, or at least doesn't have one that is part of this retirement system, but that $3 fee is going to be charged to your ticket or your case when it's adjudicated in front of a judge. Now multiply that by 10 or 20 or 30 over a period of time. And particularly, as I talk about in the book, since 2008, since the last recession, when state revenue sources really dried up, legislatures have turned to the courts more and more. So there's a $3 fee for sheriff's retirement. There's another fee that might pay for a domestic violence shelter. There's a fee that pays for other various services. And some of these are good government services. They're services that government, probably should be funding. But the question is, should only poor people stuck in the court system be paying for this, or should the tax be spread out? The reality of our system in most states is that these fines and fees get added on to court systems that are primarily occupied and paid by poor people. So one, it creates a disadvantaged situation that violates the civil rights of the poor people when they are then put back into jail because they can't afford to pay those fines and fees. But it's also a really inefficient way to raise government revenue. There was a study that I referenced in the book out of New Mexico that found that some governments were spending more money trying to collect fines and fees from the court system than they were actually bringing in. So it's a losing proposition because you're trying to get money out of poor people, and the only threat you have is if you don't pay, I'm sending you back to jail. And it's bad government. And that's one of the reasons why the criminal justice reform movement, as it relates to this idea, ending the criminalization of poverty, is very bipartisan. Republicans get it because they see that this is bad tax policy. Democrats get it because they see that the civil rights of poor people, and particularly in the urban areas, people of color, are being violated over and over again. And people on the left and the right are coming together to realize, you know what, there's a better way. There's charging poor people money and threatening them with more jail time if they can't pay doesn't do anything to make our community safer. So why are we doing it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is a lot of bipartisan agreement, and I want to come back to it in a sec, but I want to talk about one area, especially in Colorado where there isn't bipartisan agreement, because, the overlap on the Venn diagram, like if you're concerned about liberty and people's basic freedoms and civil rights, whether from the leftist perspective or from the right. I think you have one chapter in the book about the Koch brothers and the ACLU joining forces on this. There's a real overlap here about government overreach and limitations on people's liberty. But there's very little, if any, agreement, certainly in Colorado, in our legislature, about tax policy. You mentioned a second ago Tabor, so I want to talk a little bit about that because it is directly connected to this, even if maybe that's not obvious at first blush. But and by the way, for anybody who's unfamiliar, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights is a fiscal device unique to Colorado, approved 30 years ago by voters, that forces tax hikes to be voted on and that limits how much revenue government can take in. Covering state government here, I'm constantly reminded that taxation connects to basically every issue. It all comes back to that in some way. And something to keep in mind, you wrote in the book, whenever politicians promise wonderful economic outcomes from tax cuts, you wrote, somebody somewhere is always paying the price. What do you mean by that?
What I mean is if you're cutting taxes, and how you determine what that success is then matters. So it might be that cutting taxes increased some corporations' profit. It might mean that in some cases it increased the opportunity for there to be growth in certain business sectors. But it also means that money that was available to go to schools or healthcare or roads or some other government service wasn't there. And so in the context of tax policy, this is where the courts have really been abused, because if those taxes are cut and the government determines they still need that money and they turn to the courts, now who's paying? Poor people are paying. The same people who maybe don't have quite as good access to healthcare and education because of those tax cuts also now all of a sudden get this extra bill that you and I don't get because we didn't spend time in jail, because we could afford an attorney, et cetera. They have to pay this backdoor tax in the form of fines and fees, in the form of money for a jail bill or whatever. And then it has ongoing consequences related to that. One of the things the Colorado legislature, for instance, has been debating, like many legislatures over the last several years, is whether or not to rescind the law that currently allows people's driver's licenses to be suspended if you can't afford to pay fines and fees. If the fines and fees get to a certain amount and you're a poor person and you can't afford to pay, a lot of states will just suspend your driver's license. And think about how ruthless that is and how inefficient that is. You're a poor person. The court says you owe X amount of dollars in fines and fees. Now they take your driver's license away. Well, you can't drive to work now to make money to pay for those fines and fees. But the reality of being a poor person facing that situation is you're going to drive because you're going to try to support your family. And now you might be committing an actual criminal offense. Brooke Bergen, the woman that I mentioned earlier, is one of the main characters in the book, the one who did a year in jail for stealing an $8 tube of mascara. During part of the time that I was writing the book, she was in state prison in Missouri for driving without a driver's license. That's one of those crimes that becomes part of the criminalization of poverty that somebody like you and I are never going to face because we're able to write the check, generally speaking, to make the underlying criminal offense go away. And so that's where this connection to taxation, this connection to tax policy makes fixing this problem really hard. Because there's lots of things that we can do to end the criminalization of poverty. We can reform cash bail, and that will help. We can require judges to pay more attention to the Constitution and make sure that people have ability to pay hearings before they are sent away to jail or given these fines and fees. We can encourage judges to waive these fines and fees. We can even get legislatures to pass a law like one that's being considered in the state of New York right now to just end all fines and fees within the criminal justice system and get rid of them. But ultimately, the final solution comes down to tax policy, because if those fines and fees go away, that's millions and millions of dollars that's being spent on something somewhere in government that either has to be replaced or some service has to go away.
People who work in criminal justice reform are used to losing or having to compromise. I see what an uphill climb it is on all kinds of bills at the Colorado State House. But you mentioned driver's licenses. So let's talk about that. This is an area where we're seeing unbelievable movement. Colorado this year, actually, the law went into effect on January 1st.
Awesome.
This year, just became, I believe, the 16th state to ban driver's license suspensions for outstanding court debt. And a lot of people might not know this, but yeah, I mean, there's like literally more than 100,000 people every year in Colorado, or at least there has been till this law, whose driver's license are suspended for unpaid court debt that has nothing to do with dangerous driving. People's licenses are suspended. I mean, he connects in this one case back to an $8 tube of mascara. Little tiny offenses that don't make you a dangerous driver at all, that may have nothing to do with you as a driver or your car, land you in a situation where your earning potential is totally limited and your choice is to stay homebound and try to figure it out, or to break the law and drive without a license and without insurance. So Colorado just took that on. And I think, I don't know when you started reporting this book, but it couldn't have been more than a handful on that list that's now 16 deep. It couldn't have been more than a handful of states who had abolished court debt-based driver's license suspensions. That law here moved really quickly, like this issue generally. To give you a sense, and the listeners a sense, I ran into Colorado's Attorney General, Phil Weiser, at an event in 2019. And I asked him, because I'd been writing about driver's license, I asked him about fines and fees and about the license issue in particular. And he said he hadn't looked into it. And it was a very short conversation. And I thought, wow, I mean, talking about something that affects 100,000 people a year. How does the AG not know about this? And fast forward to 2021, he's testifying at the Capitol for this reform bill, which ends up getting bipartisan support and becoming law. It does seem, I guess my takeaway from that, one of it is, it does seem like people who invest any amount of time into learning how this all works and who really pays end up reaching very similar conclusions. And that's true, again, on left and right. I wonder what it is you think that has led to so much momentum in this area. Is it about public education, lobbying?
I think in the driver's license area, it's just that it makes so much sense. It's such a tyrannical use of government to take away somebody's license that they need in order to get to work. And, you know, everybody on the right and the left, hey, we want people to work, but we're going to take that away simply because they owe court debt. You know, it's funny, you mentioned the number. That's, as I was editing my book, as I was working on the book, I think the number of states that have changed the law in the way Colorado has was in single digits when I started the book. And as you said, it's at least up to 16 now. It may be more than that. Nevada recently passed a similar law. Illinois recently passed a similar law. It is definitely the area in which there is the greatest level of success happening in the legislative arena, in which Republicans and Democrats, it's sometimes taking a year or two within legislatures, are coming to realize, okay, let's not take people's driver's licenses just because they can't afford to pay for court debt. There's a town that I write about outside Atlanta called LaGrange. They did something similar. They would actually cut off people's water and electric. The city owned the water and electric service if they owed court debt. And so now you're in your home, you've got this court debt, you can't afford to pay it. You've probably got your driver's license taken away too, and now you can't afford to live in your home. Talk about the serious consequences, all because of court debt that is being used and hangs like an albatross around people's necks for years and years after they've already had their cases adjudicated. In many cases, if they even did jail time, after they've already done their jail time, and they continue to have all these consequences. So I think the driver's license thing is relatively simple for people to understand. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing progress there. Anybody who's familiar with the issue, starting to understand it, if you just Google free to drive, there's a national website. The Fines and Fees Justice Centers, some other organizations have put together that maps out how many states have changed these laws for the better. And I think they're getting more organized about it. And I think that's one of the other reasons you're having success state after state after state.
Yeah. And, you say that one's pretty cut and dry, and it is. If you take literally 5 minutes to learn about driver's license suspensions, it's hard to come away with any conclusion other than the one that you get to in your book. But I see all the time, and I'm sure you see it in the Missouri State House and elsewhere, that there is often a really big gap between what people in power understand to be the right thing to do and what they actually do. And there's a huge reason for that often is money. I had lawmakers before this driver's license bill passed. Colorado, by the way, this year passed a related bill to wipe out a whole bunch of fees in the juvenile system, which also cripple people. The policymakers would tell me, "Oh yeah, we'd love to run this," or I'd sure vote for it, but where are we going to make up the money? These fines and fees pay for judges, they pay for all kinds of programs that, as you mentioned earlier in our conversation, may well be noble things, victim services, stuff like that. So they are loath to take it on because they're worried about cuts elsewhere. So particularly for a state like Colorado, where as long as we have Tabor, this state budget will always be constrained. by those limitations, what do you advise to policymakers as to how to get over their fears on the funding front and pass these reforms that they believe in without injuring other programs that they want to support?
Well, what would help, and I make brief reference to it in the book, there is a federal bill that has at least been filed in Congress by Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii and Senator Jerry Nadler of New York that would create federal grants as incentives for states to get rid of fines and fees within the judicial system. So it would, as the federal government likes to do with highway funding and some other things, there would be this incentive process that would say, hey, we'll help you with some funding if you make this good policy decision. I think that, that sort of carrot and stick approach might be somewhat helpful. But the reality is you have to do the heavy lifting. I mean, I was in Colorado when Douglas Bruce was in his mother's basement writing Tabor. You can't turn the clock back on 20 or 30 years in the same way that we can't just get rid of the Hancock Amendment very easily in Missouri. But at some point, you have to get lawmakers to make difficult decisions about spending. If we're not going to use the court system as a backdoor tax, if we can agree that is bad public policy, then let's get rid of the bad public policy, and then let's figure out what we do with that money. I mean, for instance, as it relates to jails, in Missouri, as in most states, there is a law that allows counties to charge for jail time. Some counties do, some counties don't, but it's a law that exists in every state except for New Hampshire. And it's a law that when I first came across it, I just thought, that's insane. We pay taxes for jails. Why would we charge people for their time in jail? But they do. Whether or not the people who came up with these laws thought of it as punishment or whatever, it is what it is. So as I started writing about this issue, and I talked to lawmakers about it and I talked to advocates about it, I thought, okay, there may be a sort of democratic solution to this problem if you get rid of the charge for jail time, and that is might have to raise another tax to make up for that revenue. There may be a Republican solution that says, well, we're not going to raise any more taxes. We're just going to spend less. But are we going to really spend less in the public safety? Are we going to put fewer people in jail? Well, yeah. I mean, that's part of the solution. Ultimately, in the United States, if we start to really pay attention to the fact that we lead the world in mass incarceration, and we realize that it's too expensive and we can't afford it, and meanwhile, it's not really doing that much to improve public safety. If mass incarceration worked, we would be the safest country in the world, and we wouldn't have headlines about homicides in every major city in America. But we do, because mass incarceration doesn't work. So one of the solutions to tax policy is not to talk about tax policy. It's to go talk about mass incarceration. If we put fewer people in jail and didn't have to build new prisons and didn't have to keep those places going, we would theoretically have money left over for other government services. So I think to some degree, that's one of the arguments that you can make without having to even deal with the underlying constitutional problems that many states have related to their tax policy. Stop putting poor people in jail. Stop putting people in jail and keeping them there by a misuse of cash bail. Reduce the amount of mass incarceration in the United States, not just in state prisons and federal prisons, but in local city and county jails, and find your savings that way.
Mm-hmm. So the essential issue that you see, that is plain to see to anybody, including policymakers who look at this, is that poor people are being punished in ways that people who have money are not, even if they do the same thing. If I steal $9 of mascara, I can put it in my rear view pretty instantly. This person in your book, it ends up defining her life. And that is a really, really common kind of story. So if you think that that's bad policy, there is a ton of work left to do, right? We've seen the driver's license issue take off. Juvenile fees, there seems to be some sympathy there because people feel bad that, if a kid gets caught up with the legal system, that, you know, their whole family's life is upended because they're charged these fees that the kids can't pay, and now the parents are working 2 jobs to try to pay them off. Like, there's really compelling human stories there. But if those things speak to you, boy, there's like a ton else you can do. If you're a legislature or a city or a governor or an AG or whatever, and you care about this, you might be interested to learn about cash bail, or public defender funding, or the amount of discretion that judges have in some of these situations. A lot of that stuff is, at least in my observation, is a lot harder to move hearts and minds on, especially within our capital. So at the state level, the federal level, what do you expect the trajectory here is?
Well, I think we're headed in the right direction. I mean, there is movement on cash bail. There is movement. Missouri increased its funding last year for the first time in a very long time for its public defender's offices. There is movement on the driver's license issue. All of these things work together in order to ultimately get people to understand this issue and care about it. Where we have to really be strategic, I think, about the next steps is getting people to study the data as these things go on. So, for instance, I reference a 2013 study in the book that the nonprofit Arnold Foundation did out of Kentucky that actually shows that if you keep people in jail on minor offenses for up to 30 days because they can't afford their bail, they are 74% more likely to commit a further crime than the same person on the same sort of low risk charge that didn't end up in jail because they could afford their bail or because a judge didn't impose it or whatever. So now it's, you know, if you can explain that to people, say, wait a minute, the use of cash bail actually makes us less safe? Yes, because it increases the likelihood that low-risk defendants are going to continue to commit crimes. Why? Because they lose their houses, they lose their jobs, they lose access to their family, et cetera. It makes complete sense. So I think what really has to happen now is we have to start seeing the data. You know, we need to start engaging real scientific study as these states make a change on the driver's license law, for instance. How many more people are able to continue to work and not reoffend? And are they improving themselves financially, or getting themselves somewhat out of the cycle of poverty? If we can start telling those stories, not just anecdotally, but through data, I think then we can eventually bring more legislatures on board. I'm really interested in this bill in New York, the End Predatory Fees Act, and I'd really like to see if that happens, because, you know, often for those of us who live in flyover country, what happens on the coast ends up, you know, sort of being the canary in the coal mine. So similar to cash bail in New York and New Jersey and California kind of becoming an area for reformists to tackle. I think if New York passes a bill that gets rid of predatory fines and fees, and see how they react to that, I think it'll help give a model for other people to start doing it. Because lawmakers love model legislation. They love somebody to come to them and say, hey, you know what? This worked here. Here's what happened 1 year out. And you know, crime didn't go up and budgets weren't broken and poor people's lives were improved. That's the kind of thing that we have to see some real study on some of these things, so that we can convince lawmakers over the next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, that state by state, we have to continue moving towards a more just system.
So something you're going to hear you are hearing lawmakers talk about now. Colorado's legislative session, by the way, opens tomorrow. And I think a defining topic of the session is going to be the increase in violent crime that we've seen here as elsewhere in the country. You're going to start to see in Colorado for sure, and probably elsewhere, a a move toward further incarceration, further policing as a reaction to these increases in violent crime. In Colorado, they're talking about felonizing fentanyl. For years we've been moving in the other direction, defelonizing drug crimes. This year, they're talking about throwing more people in jail and prison for drug possession. I'm going to be really interested to see kind of if after a few years of movement in one particular direction, if we see a snap back in the other. So for anybody following local or state governments, either here in Colorado or elsewhere, this is a fragile moment, and I'm curious what advice you'd have for how people can responsibly interpret this current violent crime wave and policies that result out of it.
Well, I wrote a column on this not all that long ago, and the fact is we can't interpret it yet. And so that's one of the things that we have to be able to say to lawmakers. We have to look to the data. We have to talk to the criminologists who are going to study this over a period of several years. So, for instance, in 2020 in St. Louis, homicides spiked significantly during the worst year of the pandemic, at least so far. And yet last year, 2021, unlike Denver and some other cities, homicides dropped in St. Louis. There were some new strategies. Did those strategies work? We don't know yet. We still, the homicides in most American cities are much higher than any of us would like them to be. But the data has to drive us in terms of making these public policy decisions. One of the reasons we got to where we are right now in terms of the criminalization of poverty is every time we have one of these crime spikes, whether it's drug related, fentanyl related, opioid related, internet crime related, legislators tend to be reactive. And they're like, okay, we got to be tough on crime this year. We got to, we've got to put more people in prison. Well, over a period of time, we've done that in the United States, and we now lead the world in mass incarceration, but that didn't stop homicide spikes last year. So if that didn't stop homicide spikes last year, is putting more people in prison this year really going to help? I hope lawmakers, back away from their emotions a little bit and talk to the criminologists and the data specialists and the people that are looking at the information to say, hey, you know what? There were a lot of spikes last year during COVID. It makes sense. A lot of people didn't have jobs. A lot of people were home. A lot of people were very tense. We're going to study it. We're going to try to figure it out. But 1 year doesn't make a trend, and 1 year shouldn't cause, all sorts of changes in law. But like you, I fear that. I've looked at some of the pre-filed legislation in Missouri, and despite the fact that Missouri has made some progress in criminal justice reform in the last couple of years, in 2019, they passed a bill that said you can't put a poor person back in jail simply because they can't afford to pay their jail bill. So that was progress. There are some conservative Republicans in this legislature that believe in criminal justice reform. But what you're talking about is happening in legislatures all over the country. And I hope that this one particular time and moment during the pandemic doesn't serve as an opportunity to undo the progress that's being made in the criminal justice reform movement, because in the end, it's poor people who are paying the price.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to use that to segue into some of the questions we have. And by the way, if you're still listening and you have a question, reminder that you can put it in the chat. We have a viewer here who asked, are there any research groups or organizations working to produce this kind of necessary data? And I'll add a related question from someone else. Are there any nonprofits I can support that are working to fight the criminalization of poverty?
So there's a lot of them. The ACLU has been very active in Colorado on this issue. If I were in Colorado and I were interested in this, I would talk to the ACLU. The Fines and Fees Justice Center is a national-based organization that is starting to build chapters in a lot of states. They're very active in driving legislation on this issue and pushing for research. The Arnold Foundation is a nonprofit out of Texas that is funding some of the research. They funded the bail research out of Kentucky in 2013. and they tend to be a little bit more libertarian. The Koch brothers are interested in this issue. I don't know if they're doing any research, but they have been advocating on the libertarian and conservative, right side of the political spectrum for criminal justice reform. A lot of cities now have some good nonprofit law firms that are doing a lot of this work alongside the ACLU. In St. Louis, we've got an organization called the Arch City Defenders. They were modeled after a group called the Bronx Defenders in New York. There are probably some nonprofit law firms that are doing some of that work in Colorado as well. I don't know their names off the top of my head, but those are the organizations I would start with. The Civil Rights Corps out of Washington, D.C. is another one. Georgetown University Law School has a center that focuses a lot on the criminalization of poverty, and they've been really active in filing some amicus briefs in some of these federal rights civil lawsuits that are going on across the country, where people's rights have been trampled upon by the courts. There's a big one in Oklahoma. There's a big one in South Carolina. I write about both of those in the book. They haven't won yet. Hopefully they will eventually.
Mm-hmm. We got another question here. What role did Jim Crow racial policies play in creating the criminalization of poverty?
Well, it's a big part of it in a lot of the urban areas, and then also in sort of the rural South, because a lot of the fines and fees were originally imposed primarily on Black people. One of the things that I didn't realize before I started writing the book, and I was down at the Martin Luther King Jr. Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. And there's a part of the museum that is a recreation of the bus that Rosa Parks sat on. And alongside the top of the bus, it shows that the fines and the fees that she was charged for her crime for sitting in that bus. And that was one of the things that helped open my mind about how long this problem has been going on, is that poor people were charged, particularly Black people who were charged with violating these Jim Crow laws, were then charged these fines and fees, and it kept them poor, and in many cases kept them in jail. There is a definite racial element to this in applications in some jurisdictions. It's not entirely a problem that is just racist. A lot of the people that I started writing about early on when I discovered this problem were poor white people in rural Missouri. But there is definitely a Jim Crow element of it that has been primarily seen in the South in terms of the rise of fines and fees there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's all the time we have. Thanks for the great conversation. For anybody listening, definitely buy this book. It's really interesting. And I'll add, since somebody asked, what groups can you support? Kind of related, if you're interested in this topic, pay attention to the state legislature in Colorado. Like I said, the session starts tomorrow. Fines and fees work their way into 1 million different bills. And my goal as a reporter, I'm sure Tony shares this goal in his work too, is just to get people interested in this stuff and educated on it. So open invitation to, in addition to buying this book, support your local news outlet, pay attention to what's going on, because knowledge is power. Thanks, Tony, for doing this.
Alex, thanks very much. I appreciate it. And thanks, Tattered Cover, longtime fan of the bookstore. Wish we could have done this in person, and maybe someday post-COVID we can. I really appreciate everybody being here today.
Cool. Good night, everyone.
Alex, thanks a lot.